Hello and welcome to the fifth session of Contemporary Readings of Hegel with Ray Bracier. I'm going to hand it off to him right now.
Okay, hi. Today we're going to move on. We're going to try to see the connection between three distinct moments in Hegel's phenomenology. His discussion of, principally the relationship between his discussion of absolute freedom and terror, and the culmination of the phenomenology, which is Hegel's account of absolute knowing. What I'm going to do is try to kind of establish what I think are, underlying connections between what Hegel says about the absolute, or what he calls, the absolute notion or the absolute concept, and these his account of the French Revolution. And the reason I'm trying to establish this connection is because I think in order to understand what's going on in the phenomenology, and in order to understand what, Hegel's entire project and its claim that philosophy is a comprehension of its own time in thought, we have to understand in what way the phenomenology is conditioned by the French Revolution. Because Hegel is writing the phenomenology in roughly 15 years after the revolution, 6, and I think it's important to to try to grasp the way in which his own speculative overcoming of Kantian criticism is intrinsically conditioned by a rupture, a break that's happened, a rupture in spirit, so to speak. Revolution represents the advent of modernity. And it's because, and insofar as Hegel is self-consciously philosophizing modernity, his philosophical self-consciousness is conditioned by this rupture, this kind of the rupture of modernity. So I'm going to try, in other words, I'm going to try to explain the link in a way between revolutionary rupture, or the break represented by political modernity or cultural modernity, and Hegel's account of the absolute, of what he calls the absolute. Okay, so to do is to the first quotation on the handout is from paragraph 162, which actually occurs in the middle of Hegel's discussion of force and understanding. So it's really the first chapter of the phenomenology. It follows on the discussions of sense certainty and the thing and its properties. And there's a remarkable moment, in a way that kind of, interrupts Hegel's account of the understanding, where he basically gives, I think, what is in a way the kind of the fundamental distillation of his most profound philosophical insight. So in a way, if you want Hegel's definition of the absolute, here it is. This is and it doesn't come at the end of the book. It comes right, relatively in the opening sections of the book. So I'm going to read out the this sections in bold from paragraph 162. This simple infinity, or the absolute notion, may be called the simple essence of life, the soul of the world, the universal blood. It is neither disturbed nor interrupted by any difference, but rather is itself every difference, as also their supersession. It pulsates within itself, but does not move. Inwardly vibrates, yet is at rest. It is self-identical, for the differences are tautological. They are differences that are none. This self-identical essence is therefore related only to itself. To itself implies relationship to another, and the relation to self is rather sundering, or in other words, that very self-identicalness is an inner difference. These sundered moments are thus in and for themselves each an opposite of another. Thus, in each moment, the other is at the same time expressed, or each is not the opposite of another, but only a pure opposite. And so each is therefore in its own self the opposite of itself. In other words, it is not an opposite at all, but is purely for itself, a pure self-identical essence that has no difference in it. Now, this is one of the, this is a real kind of an extraordinary passage in Hegel. It's also another notorious passage for its for the difficulty of what it seems to be trying to communicate. But I think what is crucial to understand here, in a way what distinguishes a metaphysical reading of Hegel from a non-metaphysical reading, is how one understands what Hegel is saying here. And I think that the key for Hegel is to understand what Hegel is saying is that he's trying to give an account of essence as contradiction. Okay? What he calls the absolute essence is contradiction. And insofar as essence is, if one remember, in the metaphysical tradition, essence is both the act of being is both, the existence of an entity and its quiddity, its whatness. What Hegel is saying that both the act of being and the quiddity, both that something is and what it is, are basically constituted by contradiction. But in order to really understand what this means, is Hegel's point is not that it's not a contradiction between independently constituted terms. So in other words, Hegel is saying that we have to think what he calls the absolute essence as this movement of contradiction, where contradiction is no longer reducible to an opposition between substantially determined terms or identities. So in other words, the metaphysical understanding of this passage, the traditional metaphysical reading of Hegel, sees him as saying something like, well, there is an absolute, okay? There's an absolute, the absolute notion, which then somehow splits, okay, divides from itself and engenders another, something other than itself, and this other is its opposite. Okay? But then somehow, having divided into self and other, it reunites with itself. It returns into itself, having reintegrated its own difference from itself. So in other words, you would read this as a kind of a three-step movement, okay? From a movement of identity, of difference, and then re-identification, okay? But this is exactly what Hegel is not saying. In other words, what Hegel is saying is that the attempt to parcel out the movement into these three distinct stages or terms is the result of an abstraction, kind of an abstraction of the understanding. It says what we have to think is how we have to think the coincidence of identity and difference, or of fission and fusion. I've characterized on the handout as the indivision of division and indivision. So what he's saying is, as he puts it, and this is the next, and the crucial passage is, what he's saying is that we have to get, the traditional dilemma that plagued all substance-based metaphysics was the relationship between the one and the many. Okay, if being is essentially one, if to be is to be essentially one, how can multiplicity issue forth from ontological unity, from being as substantial integrity? And Hegel is saying that this is a false question, because once we've gone beyond, once we've substantialized being or desubstantialized essence, we understand that essence is the coincidence of indivision and division. And this is why he says, in the next section in bold on the handout, for the division into two moments has already taken place, excluded from the self-identical and set apart from it. What was supposed to be the self-identical is thus already one of these two moments, instead of being the absolute essence. So what he's saying is that the absolute essence, not the first. It's neither the first nor the final stage of this process. And to think of the absolute essence as an independently existing identity is already to have abstracted it from the movement, the movement of fission, which actually is, constitutes its own identity. This is why he's saying that the opposition between identity and difference, or between self and other, is an abstraction that only, that unfolds if one has separated one term and through an act of intellectual abstraction, if one has separated one term and juxtaposed it to the other. So what he's saying is that we have to think a relation which actually constitutes its terms. Okay, so this is a claim about the primacy of relation, but it's no longer a relation between independently existing terms. So therefore it's not a relation between two distinguishable things, but it's actually a self-relation. Hence, this is Hegel's famous claim about self, the concept of self-relating negativity. Contradiction is self-relating negativity insofar as identity, the definition of a thing as identical, is precisely constituted through its not being, not being what it is. Each thing is contradictory, which means that the relationship between self and other is internal to every constituted entity or thing, which means that it's a mistake. In fact, what he's actually saying is that there are no independently existing things or separable substances or entities. Is what is primary, or what is essential, is the movement of contradiction, which he says has always already happened. This is why he's saying the division into two moments has already taken place. So it's not so. If you think of the famous kind of slogan, "One divides into two," what he's saying is it's not that there's one, two, and then somehow kind of fuses back into one. He's saying that the splits, one is already two. The one has always already split into two. Two, each moment each distinct moment, contains within itself this, okay, because it has the relationship to its own other within itself. It is itself nothing but this, primordial division. This is why he when he goes on in the passage, this is the final section in bold, the different moments of self-sundering, which simply means splitting, and of becoming self-identical or fusion, are therefore likewise only this movement of self-supersession. The movement of self-supersession is that the self-sundering and the self-identification have always already vanished into one another. There's no kind of there's no sequential articulation of these moments. And then he goes on, for since the self-identical, which is supposed first to sunder itself or become its opposite, is an abstraction, or is already itself a sundered moment, its self-sundering is therefore a supersession of what it is, and therefore the supersession of its dividedness. And supersession here is to be understood in terms of sublation, or the overcoming of its dividedness, but also of its identity or of its indivision as somehow separable from its dividedness. So Hegel's conclusion, its becoming self-identical is equally a self-sundering. In other words, self-identification is the same as self-division. What becomes identical with itself thereby opposes itself to its self-sundering, thereby puts itself on one side, or rather it becomes a sundered moment. So what he's saying is that each step, we have to bear in mind every stage of the dialectic, these, any moment, whether it's these moments being kind of shapes of consciousness or shapes of spirits, each of them is only separable by an intellectual abstraction, which makes it seem as if there is a relationship between, two terms, self and other, or a distinction between knowing and truth, or between for us and in itself. But at the most fundamental level for Hegel, the separability or the distinctiveness of each moment is only an abstraction. And to think speculatively is to grasp the coincidence of distinction and indistinction, division. Okay, now, so I realize now this is an extremely abstract, kind of characterization of Hegel's, conception of the absolute. But I think it can be rendered more. I think hopefully by the end we might have, have achieved greater traction on how this remarkably abstract characterization can be understood in relationship with time. Because what I'm proposing is that there's a link between what Hegel calls this absolute essence and a new understanding of time, because this is also the rupture of modernity ushers in a new kind of self-consciousness, which means a new experience of time. So I think what I want to do today is to try to kind of, establish a link between this, fearsomely abstract characterization of the absolute and a completely concrete account of time, of time as occurrence, or time as what happens or what befalls us. But in order to do this, we have to kind of go through a couple of intermediate steps. So what I want now to do is to focus on Hegel's account of the revolution, and it comes actually in the section. It comes in the section immediately following the discussion of Lord and Bondsman, which we discussed last time, and the discussion of no, I'm sorry, it comes in the section on reason, okay, which happens, several hundred pages after the discussion of Lord and Bondsman. But in order to understand the connection between Lord and Bondsman and absolute freedom and terror, we have to, quickly recapitulate his account of Stoicism, skepticism, and the unhappy consciousness. These are shapes of spirits, in a way, that whose incompleteness allows us to understand what Hegel finds flawed in the shape of self-consciousness that emerges in the revolution, in the French Revolution. So first of all, Stoicism. So once we've overcome Stoicism, really is the kind of the first shape of self-consciousness that emerges out of the self-consciousness of the bondsman who has realized, that he can achieve or realize his freedom through work understood as universal formative activity. But the way in which, nevertheless, the way in which the bondsman understands his own freedom initially is incomplete. In other words, and the result of this incomplete understanding is Stoicism, as Stoicism is the form of self-consciousness in which one works on oneself in order to liberate oneself from worldly bondage. In other words, the Stoic seeks to transform his own subjectivity or consciousness in order to realize his freedom, or understood as his independence from objective determination. So in Stoicism, Hegel writes, thinking consciousness as determined in the form of abstract freedom is thus only the incomplete negation of otherness. It's incomplete, so negation of otherness understood as objective determination, but it's incomplete because it negates, it's the subject negating his or her determination at the hands of worldly constraints, but without trying to transform those worldly constraints as such. Okay, so it's a completely, so you withdraw from the world, and in order to achieve a kind of serene indifference to its travails and injustices. Okay. So this is the first incomplete manifestation of self-conscious freedom. The next moment is skepticism. Okay. Skepticism, writes Hegel, involves a split between two kind of moments in self-consciousness in skepticism carries out a more radical negation of the otherness of the world. So Stoicism carried out a partial negation of otherness or alterity. With skepticism, according to Hegel, self-consciousness achieves a much more radical suspension of its objective determination because it suspends objectivity as such. It famously says, it leads to a kind of a suspension of judgment about as to objectivity, as to what does or does not exist, because it tries to show that any determinate claim about the world can be contradicted. And because of this equipollence, because of this, the equivalence of every affirmation or negation about objective states of things, the skeptical consciousness seeks merely to suspend all judgment and achieve a kind of, again, a serene indifference to the world. So it asserts its own freedom, its own independence, but only at the cost of negating the independence of the world, or its own determination at the hands of something that is other than it. So Hegel writes, this consciousness is therefore the unconscious, thoughtless rambling which passes back and forth from the one extreme of self-identical self-consciousness to the other extreme of the contingent consciousness that is both bewildered and bewildering. But it does not itself bring these two thoughts of itself together. At one time, it recognizes that its freedom lies in rising above all the confusion and contingency of existence, and at another time equally admits to a relapse into occupying itself with what is unessential. Now, what he's saying is that skeptical consciousness is split between two things, between the essential and unessential, and between self-identical self-consciousness and heterogeneous self-consciousness, or between an independent self-consciousness and independent self-consciousness. And the claim is that because every judgment about any certainty about what is, any claim to knowledge, any self-conscious assertion about what exists, can be shown to be immediately undermined by its negation, that means that this subverts the necessity of judgment. It subverts the necessity of any judgment that claims that asserts a connection between an object X and a property Y. But skeptical self-consciousness is at one and the same time the judging consciousness, the consciousness to judge or to assert, and the consciousness that undermines every assertion. And it doesn't only undermine every assertion, it also undermines every negation, because every negation of an assertion can equally be contradicted by another assertion. An infinite alternation between affirmation and negation leads to a kind of sheer indetermination. It doesn't yield a determinate negation, it just yields this kind of interminable oscillation between affirmation and negation, or between assertion and denial. And the result then is, and what Hegel says is that interesting is that this self-consciousness, although it asserts its sovereign autonomy, its freedom, its absolute freedom from any objective determination, it refuses, it wants to say that I can assert anything and its contrary, but nothing in the world compels me to to affirm or deny anything, contradistinction to anything else. It doesn't realize how, as it oscillates between these two moments of affirmation and denial, and also of necessity and contingency, it doesn't realize how these are poles of itself. It is itself, how it can't stop asserting. Because the problem that the skeptic faces is that he wants to reach this definitive suspension of judgment. By its own nature is compelled to keep judging. So even the contradiction of assertion is yet another kind of assertion. So the the ultimate cessation of assertion, or the definitive suspension of belief or of faith in the world, is unachievable. So and this is why, skeptical consciousness, says Hegel, is split. Its deeds and its words always belie one another. It has itself a doubly contradictory consciousness of unchangeableness and sameness. But it keeps these two poles apart, so that it's always, any assertion will be contradicted by it, but it is itself generating the assertions, because it doesn't accept any external authority. And the result is this kind of, infantilism. It's a kind of, it's an assertion of autonomy and independence, but of a puerile sort. And interestingly enough, if you look at Hegel's concluding sentence here, is that its talk, i.e. the talk of skeptical consciousness, is in fact like the squabbling of self-willed children, one of whom says A if the other says B, and in turn says B if the other says A, and who by contradicting themselves buy for themselves the pleasure of continually contradicting one another. The term self-willed here is crucial. It recurs frequently in the phenomenology, and Hegel says that self-willed autonomy or self-willed freedom is unsatisfactory. It's one-sided. So Hegel thinks that, again, self-consciousness has to achieve its freedom and independence through another, but it can't simply assert its freedom and independence one-sidedly, abstractly cancelling or negating the claim made upon it by its other, whether this other is the world or another self-consciousness. And Hegel will show that both those things must go together. Self-consciousness will only be able to realize its freedom and independence by recognizing the independence of its other, which fuses the independence of another subject and of the object as such. Okay. Now we then move. Okay, the third movement in this sequence of incomplete assertions of independence is the unhappy consciousness, which is really the first manifestation of religious consciousness. This is very important, because now we've got three stages here. We had Stoicism, then we had skepticism, both of which are kind of epistemic stances. But with the unhappy consciousness, epistemic frustration gives rise to religious reverence. I think for Hegel is essentially religious, and it's the turn to religiosity inspired by the alleged failures of epistemic satisfaction. If one cannot achieve epistemic satisfaction through conceptual understanding or through knowledge, one renounces it in the name of some experience of alterity, which is even more radical than those countenanced by Stoicism and skepticism. So the unhappy consciousness now sees this, necessity, universality, and independence entirely outside of itself. Okay, instead of trying to reconcile these two moments within itself, what it does is it breaks off its own freedom or its own kind of independence and reifies it in the form of an external transcendence, which is divine or supernatural, and prostrates itself before this alterity, this otherness, which it holds to be superior to it, and which it claims conditions all of its activities, whether cognitive or practical. So in other words, the unhappy consciousness renounces its own claim to freedom and independence. It reifies its own freedom and independence in the shape of a god, a divine force, and it finds satisfaction only by abjuring its own independence in the name of an objective independence that it has itself generated. So this is the other contradiction. The unhappy consciousness generates the radical independent alterity before which it prostrates itself, but then at the same time claims that it is utterly dependent. Okay, so it claims to be utterly dependent upon an independence that it has itself generated. That's the contradiction. So Hegel writes, for though this consciousness renounces the show of satisfying its feeling of self, it obtains the actual satisfaction of it, for it has been desire, work, and enjoyment. As consciousness, it has willed, act, and enjoyed. In other words, he's saying that this is a religious consciousness, okay, that gives up, offers up its enjoyment, its satisfaction, its desire, work, and enjoyment to God. Okay, the unhappy consciousness does everything for the sake of God. But Hegel's saying is that it derives satisfaction from this sacrifice of self-satisfaction. So he goes on, similarly, even its giving of thanks, in which it acknowledges the other extreme as the essential being and counts itself nothing, is its own act which counterbalances the action of the other extreme and meets the self-sacrificing beneficence with a like action. It delivers over to consciousness only the surface of its being, yet consciousness also gives thanks, and in surrendering its own action, its essential being, it really does more than the other, which only sheds a superficial element of itself. These last lines actually is Hegel's critique of the metaphorics of sacrifice, specifically in Christianity. What he's saying is that so when we pray, when we give thanks to God for His munificence and beneficence, and specifically for having sacrificed His Son for the sake of our salvation. In fact, this is initially the unhappy consciousness views the divine sacrifice, God's sacrifice of His Son, as being a greater sacrifice than any carry out. So it sees itself as infinitely indebted to God. But in fact, says Hegel, it's consciousness that has carried out a greater sacrifice than God, because God, because God is infinite, in making Himself finite through His Son, He is sacrificing. He's not really sacrificing anything, because God, because the finite is entirely dependent upon the infinite. Sacrifice of a part of Himself in finitude and the finitude of death, Christ's death on the cross, is itself immediately cancelled up, swallowed up in God's infinity, if God's infinity is understood substantially as something that is entirely sovereign and independent of finitude. So this is why Hegel writes, if the other extreme, by which he means God, the divine extreme, delivers over to consciousness only the surface of its being, he means that the surface of its being is its own finitude. The surface, the finite is only a part, a superficial part of the infinite. So in sacrificing a part of itself, the infinite is really sacrificing nothing. Whereas the unhappy consciousness, or the consciousness that sacrifices its own, enjoyment, its own desire for self-satisfaction to the divine, to God, is actually sacrificing the substance of its being. Okay, and this is why he's saying, because in surrendering its own action, its essential being, to God, it really does more than the other, which only sheds a superficial element of itself. And in a way, it's what Hegel is saying is that substance of the infinite here is derived from the self-sacrificing of finite substance. It's generated, it's the self-sacrificing of finite substance that generates the alleged infinity of divine substance. So this is another, and again, this is another kind of example of an incomplete or contradictory affirmation of independence. Now, why this is now the unhappy consciousness is here. We have an articulation between these two epistemic moments, skepticism, and now with the unhappy consciousness, we have the I guess the kind of the essential prefiguration of a kind of religious consciousness and a religious experience of the infinite, and Hegel will try to bring these two together. He will try to show how conceptual self-consciousness, the experience of freedom and independence that drives conceptual self-consciousness, must be brought together the experience of infinite alterity, which is at the core of religious consciousness. And in absolute knowing, what he wants to do is to bring about, in a way, he wants to show that the satisfaction of our cognitive desire and the satisfaction of our spiritual desire can only be ultimately be brought together in reason as absolute knowing. But we'll return to this in a few minutes. Now we're going to move. Okay, we're moving now to his discussion of the French Revolution. And the French Revolution oscillates back is a complete denial of, obviously it's a kind of an assertion of human freedom. It's the first kind of unqualified assertion of human independence, of human beings as capable of self-determination, okay, independently of any divine ordinance, as represented by the institution of monarchy. So in the French Revolution, there's a new understanding of freedom, of self-conscious freedom, which is incarnated in the notion of the general will. And the revolution, the revolutionary consciousness sees itself as implementing the requirements of the general will, where the general will is the will of one and all. The general will is overcomes the particularity of the individual will, and says that what is good, freedom for the individual, can only be achieved through collective freedom, freedom for all. But Hegel says that this is still only, once again, a still incomplete or abstract conception of the freedom of self-consciousness. And it's because of its abstractness that it fails to reconcile the contradiction between the the universal requirements of the general will, the particular requirements of the individual will. And this tension, which is at the heart of the revolutionary will, is what generates the terror. In other words, so what Hegel is saying is that the terror is a direct consequence of the one-sided or abstract conception of universal freedom in Jacobin self-consciousness. So he writes in 589, just as the individual self-consciousness does not find itself in this universal work of absolute freedom coexistent substance, so little does it find itself in the deeds proper and individual actions of the will of this freedom. Now, two things quickly here. What he means is that the individual self-consciousness is now forced to renounce all its private interests, okay, its self-interest in on behalf of the general will, okay, of the common will. This general will is incarnated in the state, the revolutionary state, the republic, after the decapitation of the king. And in a way so that the freedom of self-consciousness or substantialized in the revolutionary republic, which is to say in the revolutionary state. But the revolutionary state is vitiated by this contradiction between the general will and the private will. Freedom is now, suffers from this kind of, crippling debility, according to Hegel. The contradiction between the universal and the particular. And then he goes on in this the next sentence from paragraph 589. Before the universal can perform a deed, it must concentrate itself into the one of individuality and put at the head an individual self-consciousness. For the universal will is only an actual will in a self, which is a one. But thereby all other individuals are excluded from the entirety of this deed and have only a limited share in it, so that the deed would not be a deed of the actual universal self-consciousness. Universal freedom, therefore, can produce neither a positive work nor a deed. There is left for it only negative action. It is merely the fury of destruction. Now, why? Hegel here insists that the universal can perform a deed. In other words, for it to actualize itself, it must concentrate itself into the one of individuality and put at the head an individual self-consciousness. Because, he says, because this conception of the general will is abstract and one-sided, the effectuation of the general will can only be achieved through another particularization. It can only be incarnated in another individual or group of individuals. In this case, Robespierre or the Committee for Public Safety. So in other words, so the paradox is that because of the abstract nature of the general will in this context, its requirements can only be articulated through the consciousness of individual subjects or individual wills, and they can only be implemented through the actions of these same individuals. So what happens is that the effectuation of the general will actually excludes all other individuals. The effectuation of this abstract universal necessitates the exclusion of all other individuals. So in other words, this is why Robespierre assumes, sees himself as the mouthpiece for the general will, and his decisions are all taken on behalf of the general will, but he assumes absolute authority, the absolute authority of the universal, in a way which supersedes the demands of all other individuals. And the result of this is the terror. Okay, because of this kind of contradiction between, because the universal will can only be effectuated in a kind of a particular will, and this particular will must disregard all rival claimants to the general will. It can only attack or disqualify all those rival claimants, and this is of course the terror. So this kind of, this abstract universal freedom can produce neither a positive work nor a deed. There's left for it only negative action. It is merely the fury of destruction. Okay, and this is, now the next paragraph is important here. This is paragraph 590. So Hegel is saying that in the revolutionary states, there's an abstract opposition between the universal and the particular, as if they're not properly mediated with one another, and therefore not properly kind of harmoniously articulated. In 590, for that universality which does not let itself advance to the reality of an organic articulation, and whose aim is to maintain itself in an unbroken continuity, creates a distinction within itself, because it is movement or consciousness in general. And moreover, by virtue of its own abstraction, it divides itself into extremes, equally abstract, into a simple, inflexible, cold universality, and into the discrete, absolute, hard rigidity and self-willed atomism of actual self-consciousness. So that once again, so this universality, this abstract universality is split. It's split between the universal, between an abstract particularity, and which takes a shape of a universality which is incapable of countenancing the demands of particularity, which sees particularity as equally abstract, and on the other hand, into what he calls the kind of the self-willed atomism, actual self-consciousness, which is to say that only it's the Jacobin, the representative, the self-appointed representative of the general will, sees his individual self-consciousness as the infallible arbiter of the dictates of the general will. And Hegel then goes on in the next section in bold: the relation then of these two, since each exists indivisibly and absolutely for itself, and thus cannot dispose of a middle term which would link them together, is one of wholly unmediated pure negation, and the negation moreover of the individual as a being existing in the universal. So in other words, the kind of the universal and the particular, or necessity and contingency, can only negate one another. So the necessity of the revolutionary requirements can only be the negation of the contingency of the requirements of particular interest. And this unmediated negation, this unmediated pure negation, which doesn't allow which doesn't understand that concrete universality requires concrete individuality, the proper mediation of the universal and the particular is that can only be achieved through a concrete universal, which is an individual. And it's the freedom of the individual, okay, which satisfies the desire for freedom of self-consciousness. In the absence of this concrete, the individual as concrete universal, what you get is this, this fury of this abstract negation, this unmediated pure negation, which simply negates merely as a dispensable and contingent obstacle to the satisfaction of universality. So therefore, Hegel writes, the sole work indeed of universal freedom is therefore death. A death too which has no inner significance or filling, for what is negated is the empty point of the absolutely free self. It is thus the coldest and meanest of all deaths, with no more significance than cutting off a head of cabbage or swallowing a mouthful of water. So, execution by guillotine is, in a way, it's a perfectly rational death, and in a way, unlike the forms of public execution carried out in medieval societies, such as hanging, drawing, and quartering, or beheadings. Here now we have an execution which is completely, perfectly rational. So you devise an instrument. The guillotine is a way of administering death, which is allegedly painless and therefore maximally efficient. But because of this, because of its efficiency, it deprives execution of any symbolic pathos. This is why death by guillotine is the coldest and meanest of all deaths. It's an insignificant death because the individual here is insignificant. The individual's refusal to conform to the requirements of the general will is simply is not invested with any kind of internal meaning or significance. It has no spiritual significance, and the recalcitrant individual here is merely the head. The abstract, the abstract incarnation of individuality, as opposed to its concretization. Okay, so this is why this execution, terror, revolutionary terror, deprives the deprives particularity of even the significance of resistance, because it's simply seen as a pathological obstruction to the satisfaction of universality. And obviously, and this is where Hegel's going to make a link with Kant, because Hegel sees in this kind of terror of absolute freedom a kind of a prefiguration of Kant's categorical imperative, where once again there's an unmediated opposition between the universal and the particular, or between the requirements of the moral law, or which is analogous to the general will, and the particular self-interest, which Kant castigates as pathological. So therefore, just as the Jacobins, simply execute any kind of particular inclination which resists the satisfaction of the general will. So the moral law requires the extirpation of any particular pathological inclination which impedes the the realization of narrative. This is the link that Hegel is making here, and the final, paragraph 591 is simply kind of elaborating on this point, why he thinks that the factionality, the abstract conception of the general will, or the abstract conception of universality, generates division within itself and generates factionality, because it's incapable of properly mediating the individual and the universal. It means that any attempt to realize the universal will always pit one individual against another individual, or groups of individuals against other groups of individuals, which is the hallmark, as he sees it, of a kind of an abstract revolutionary militancy. This is why he writes, the government is itself nothing else but a self-established focus of the individuality of the universal will. But the government which wills and executes its will from a single point, at the same time wills and executes a specific order and action. On the one hand, it excludes all other individuals from its acts, and on the other hand, it thereby constitutes itself a government that is a specific will, and so stands opposed to the universal will. Consequently, it is absolutely impossible for it to exhibit itself as anything else. And what is called government is merely the victorious faction. And in the very fact of its being a faction lies the direct necessity of its overthrow. And its being government makes it conversely into a faction and so guilty. So what he's saying here is that this logic, the logic of the abstract realization of freedom, creates this this inevitable antagonism, where each individual who lays claim to the authority of the general will immediately finds him or herself contradicted by another, and therefore the result is you can only the authority of government becomes dictatorial, because you have to assume absolute authority in order to be able to realize or carry out the requirements of the general will. But in assuming absolute authority or dictatorial authority, you immediately inculpate yourself as an oppressor, or as trying to assume the absolute authority of the monarch. So this is the kind of the vicious logic which vitiates this abstract conception of freedom. Okay, so now, we've gotten to this stage here now. So why is this relevant to what Hegel is going to say about absolute knowing? Because Hegel does think that the French Revolution is this, it's an assertion of the freedom of self-consciousness, and it's an assertion which realizes that self-consciousness must be self-determining. It cannot accept any external authority, any supernatural or divine authority that would impede the realization of its freedom. So he thinks that this is the entirely positive and necessary achievement of revolutionary consciousness, but he thinks it's, you know, it's still incomplete because it hasn't properly reconciled. It hasn't reconciled the universal and the particular, but also it hasn't reconciled the two aspects of self-consciousness. The self-consciousness which sees its freedom, you know, its cognitive independence as you know, lying entirely within itself, you know, sees itself as being able to, you know, in a way to reshape the world in its own image. This is the abstract subjectivism, I guess, of Kant's critical philosophy. I mean, Hegel sees a critical philosophy as a kind of, you know, as a kind of a epistemological analog of revolutionary Jacobinism. But it leaves, it still leaves, it has an abstract conception of heteronomy, because it can only conceive of heteronomy, which is to say dependence upon another, in terms of something that is absolutely transcendent. In other words, some kind of divine or supernatural transcendence. You know, and this is why, in a way, even you know, Jacobinism is interestingly accompanied by a form of deism. It's not atheistic. It's simply it sees the general will as ultimately, you know, kind of consonant with the will of a divine creator, but a divine creator who's no longer a kind of simply a prime mover or a kind of a philosophical deity, as opposed to a deity, you know, the Abrahamic God, the God of reason, as opposed to the God of revelation. And what's missing, and so what Hegel's going to say is that in a way, what religion has the resources to achieve what revolutionary reason lacks, which is to say the kind of the achievement of a communal self-consciousness in which universality and particularity are reconciled, albeit imperfectly. And what he's going to say in his transition to absolute knowing is that there is what is religious consciousness? It's the consciousness of infinity, of infinity understood qualitatively, as opposed to kind of merely the potential infinity of an interminable sequence. And he says that this is what is most important about religious consciousness. That religious consciousness is, you know, in a way structured around the experience of a radical alternative, a radical independence, which is, you know, the independence of qualitative infinity. But this experience, because this infinity refuses to be rationalized, because consciousness in a way refuses to recognize it has itself generated this infinity. This is an infinity which is a conception of infinity which is incompatible with the satisfaction of freedom. with the imperative for self-consciousness to achieve freedom, its own rational freedom. On the other hand, the obverse of this is the purely rational understanding of freedom, which doesn't acknowledge the role played by I guess by the community. Okay, doesn't understand the role played by the community in the realization of freedom, and therefore ends up with a one-sided assertion of freedom and of rational self-determination at the expense of all particular inclination, which it views as pathological or as deviant. So what he's saying is that now the task now is going to be to bring these two forms, the form and content of self-consciousness, of self-conscious experience and self-consciousness self-experience together. And this is what he thinks happens in absolute knowing. To understand absolute knowing, we must here reiterate Hegel's the definition he gave right at the very beginning of what he calls, the absolute. He said, the preface he writes, the true is the whole, but the true can only be the true must be grasped as subject as well as substance. So in other words, here's a kind of Hegel's the most schematic characterization of the absolute in Hegel is that it's the becoming substance, the becoming subject of substance. And remember, this was very important because Hegel refuses, he says the mistake of dogmatic metaphysicians is to, appeal to a kind of a direct apprehension, an immediate apprehension of the absolute or an intuition of the absolute, which unwittingly substantializes it. So what Hegel is doing, I want to suggest, is that he's desubstantializing the absolute. The becoming subject of substance is the desubstantialization of the absolute in a way which allows us to rethink substance, which is to say being, as occurrence, or as the occurrentness of time. But this is very abstract yet, and we can't quite understand what this means. To start understanding what this means, we have to see how the three moments of objectivity. Okay, at the end in his chapter, in his account of absolute knowing, Hegel reiterates what he takes to be the three stages of cognitive objectivity: the immediate being for sense certainty, the determinate thing for perception, and the universal essence for the understanding. And this is in 789. This is paragraph 789 from Absolute Knowing. Thus, the object is in part immediate being, or in general, a thing corresponding to immediate consciousness. In part, an othering of itself, its relationship or being for another, and being for itself, i.e. determinateness, corresponding to perception, and in part essence, or in the form of a universal, corresponding to the understanding. So what he's saying is that the notion of substance, and remember, substance I think here is just another word for objectivity, has three aspects. It has the aspect of immediate being, the immediate being apprehended in sensation, the determinate, the thing and its properties, the determination of an object with properties, which is apprehended in perception, or the object of perception, and finally the universality which is grasped through the understanding. Okay, and these are the three, and what Hegel says that this is the concept, a proper kind of conceptual understanding of the notion of objectivity requires understanding the interdependence of these three moments. Now, so the question, now we know that Hegel wants to move beyond the understanding. So we've had consciousness, okay, apprehends the object as an immediate being, as a determinate thing, or as a universal essence. So self-consciousness, in a way, has to apprehend objectivity beyond the determinations of consciousness. Okay? But it still has to apprehend this objectivity without, conceptually, okay? Because self-consciousness is, intrinsically notional or conceptual. So therefore, it must achieve a conception of objectivity that integrates, that retains all these moments of objectivity for consciousness, but in a way goes beyond them, and goes beyond them specifically in understanding the universality of the thing, or the universality of objectivity, as not simply entirely independently of it. So in other words, so long as one remains at the level of metaphysics, substance has universal determinations, but these universal determinations are fixed and immutable. If one goes to the level of the Kantian critique of metaphysics, one understands the universal determinations of objectivity as residing in the subject. Okay, all these conceptual determinations are subjective, and they're not characteristics of things in themselves. So now that the task is going to be to have a notion of objectivity that is neither static, that is neither essentialist in a metaphysical sense, nor subjectivist in a transcendental sense. Challenge. And this is why, and to do this, we need to kind of go beyond, we need to integrate the experience of infinity, which is the hallmark of religious consciousness. So this is why this diversion through religious experience is necessary for Hegel. Reason must think objectivity beyond the reified universal of the understanding, without ceding transcendence to religious intuition. In other words, to say that there is transcendence. Okay, it's a way of saying that there is transcendence because universals are not universal determinations are not fixed and static. But the transcendence is neither divine, it's neither kind of anchored in a divine substance, nor is it the transcendence of the unknowable thing in itself, which can't be conceptually determined at all. So this is how Hegel's going to try to bring together subject and object. He must find a way of giving rational form to the religious apprehension of infinity. And this is, so in paragraph 794, he says, what's been going on in the phenomenology is that there are these two series. There's on the one hand, you've got self-consciousness affirming its own sovereign independence, either affirming its own independence one-sidedly, which is a kind of subjectivism, or abnegating its own independence one-sidedly, and granting independence and sovereignty to the object, which is to say to the supernatural or the divine. And both, so now absolute knowing involves superseding these one-sided, the one-sided assertion of independence abnegation of independence. Okay, in other words, reason and religion. And he writes, so this is the next sentence in bold here. The unification of the two sides has not yet been exhibited. It is this that closes the series of the shapes of spirit. For in it, spirit attains to a knowledge of itself, not only as it is in itself, absolute content, nor only as it is for itself, as a form devoid of content, or as the aspect of self-consciousness, but as it is both in essence and in actuality, or in and for itself. Okay, so what I think Hegel is saying here is that what spirit is in itself is intimate, is intimated in religious experience. Spirit is infinity. It's actual infinity. Religion has an intimation of this infinity, but it refuses to give it conceptual determination. It refuses to bestow conceptual form upon it, and therefore to shape it and to grasp it. So that's infinity in itself. But otherwise, self-consciousness can only kind of affirm its own sovereign independence in a way which is devoid of content. Okay, which is devoid of content, and this is, as in mind here, is Kantian subjectivism. So the point is to bring these two things together, to bring essence and actuality together, so that self-consciousness can achieve, can realize its freedom and independence both in and for itself. And this is what is said in the next chapter. Now I'm going to move. Okay, we're running out of time, so I'm going to move very fast now in order to leave enough room for discussion. But this next sentence in bold is important. So the movement is from the consciousness of infinity in itself, i.e. religious consciousness, to self-consciousness, to the self-consciousness of infinity in and for itself, or spirit. And Hegel writes, for experience is just this, that the content, which is spirit, is in itself substance, and therefore an object of consciousness. But this substance, which is spirit, is the process in which spirit becomes what it is in itself. This process of reflecting itself into itself, that it is in itself truly spirit. It is in itself the movement which is cognition, the transforming of that in itself into that which is for itself, of substance into subject, of the object of consciousness into an object of self-consciousness, i.e. into an object that is just as much superseded, or into the notion. Next quotation in bold, I think, is very significant. Hegel writes, insofar as spirit is necessarily this immanent differentiation, its intuited whole appears over against its simple self-consciousness. And since then the former is what is differentiated, it is differentiated into its intuited pure notion, into time, and into the content, or into the in itself. So, okay, now, so the consummation of the self-consciousness of spirit requires understanding exactly how spirit has been knowing itself. And all through these stages, we know self-consciousness has been generating its own object, its own other, in many different ways, but now has acquired the resources to actually conceptualize its own self-relation explicitly, to realize it now understands that the other, which it took to be independent, is in fact another manifestation of itself. Therefore, that it can only achieve its freedom and autonomy not only by recognizing how the autonomy, that the independence of the object, or the independence of substantial reality, i.e. what is in itself, can only be achieved through the mediation of spirits as collective self-consciousness. So in other words, the relationship to objectivity is mediated by intersubjectivity, by the relationship amongst a community of self-consciousnesses. Okay, so that what is in itself, which is what is absolute in a substantial sense, is necessarily mediated by the work of mutual recognition, the mutual recognition amongst a community of self-consciousnesses. And this would be, this is spirit, but now spirit which has grasped that what self-substance, it is itself substance, and that the substance in its independence, in its substantial independence, happens, okay, is effectuated in and through subjective self-consciousness. So here's a final quote. So this is the claim now, that the movement is from the subjective representation of substance, i.e. from the representation of substance as something that exists, out there independently of anything we think or believe about it, to a notion of substance as reflecting itself into itself as subject. So in other words, the subject now understands itself as the self-reflection of substance. And here's one final passage from the Absolute Knowing chapter. This is paragraph 803. Substance, just by itself, would be intuition devoid of content, or the intuition of a content which, as determinates, would be only accidental and would lack necessity. Substance would pass for the absolute only insofar as it was thought or intuited as absolute unity, and all content would, as regards its diversity, have to fall outside of it into reflection. And reflection does not pertain to substance, because substance would not be subject, would not be grasped as reflecting on itself, and reflecting itself into itself would not be grasped as spirit. This whole, this is a reference to Kant. Kant, in a way, overcomes, supersedes the metaphysical conception of substance through his resort to forms of intuition. And space and time as forms of intuition, it's an intuition devoid of content. So that, in other words, that what is non-conceptual, independent of the concept, is the spatial temporal manifold, which in a way has no intrinsic necessity within it. Conceptual necessity is superimposed, or allegedly superimposed, depending on your reading of Kant, onto this spatial temporal manifold. So all the content of substance falls outside of substance into reflection. It's transcendental reflection, in a way that determines how how substance can be objectively determined. Transcendental reflection explains how substance can be objectively determined, but in itself, it's void of determination. Itself is void of determination, and so what Hegel is saying is that only by grasping substance as subject, or by grasping the subject as substance's reflection into itself, can we understand how substance is self-determining, how substance is self-determining, but only through its subjectivation, only through its emergence as subject. Okay, finally, I'm going to wrap up. So what is, there's a lot going, obviously there's a lot going on here. There's a lot that needs to be unpacked. But I think that this final account, I mean, Hegel's claim that substance must be conceived as reflecting itself into itself as subject is, really completely revolutionary philosophical insight, which I think, through which Hegel is trying to kind of think, prefigure a revolution in philosophy analogous to kind of the French Revolution, which means, going beyond the whole metaphysical understanding of substance, but also going beyond both the Cartesian and the Kantian conceptions of subject, of subjectivity. And I think what the end result of this is, I think that it's a mistake to think that, first of all, absolute knowing is not the absolute substantialization of knowledge, in the sense in which it would be a kind of the apprehension of an infinite catalogue of facts, or some kind of the iteration of an infinite series of judgments or assertions. So in a way, absolute knowledge is not knowing everything, where everything is seen, is understood as the totality of facts. Okay, rather I think that absolute knowing, and he uses the word absolute knowing, not absolute knowledge. Absolute knowing means there is nothing that can't be known. There is nothing that is unknowable. That's the first thing. It doesn't mean that knowing consummates itself. Some kind of completely self-actualized substance. It's not about the substantialization of knowledge. On the contrary, it's about its radical desubstantialization in a way which unbinds knowledge from the constraints of a metaphysical conception of objectivity. And I think that what Hegel is saying is that we have to understand, to understand the absolute, not only as substance but as subject, and not where the becoming subject of the absolute can't be understood as some kind of, as the actualization of a potency, as it would be in Aristotelian terms, is to understand the absolute as what happens, as the absolute as an occurrence. The absolute is what happens, it's what occurs. And I think that what Hegel is doing is that he's desubstantializing time. In other words, he's saying that with the advent of modernity, we have a completely new experience of time. Time no longer as the unfolding of a sequence. Time is no longer kind of simply the kind of the circular motion, the repetition of a cycle, but nor is it simply a linear trajectory from beginning to end, as it would be perhaps like on the I guess a kind of an eschatological or theological conception. These are substantializations of time. What Hegel is saying now is that what is absolute is time as a kind of, as an absolute occurrence, as a break in self-consciousness. And so that the self-consciousness of time, of the occurrence of time, is also the self-consciousness as contradiction or as rupture. The whole then, when Hegel's, the whole is not a completed actuality, a consummated potency, completeness. and current incompleteness, which means understanding what Hegel calls contemporaneity, our own time or the present. Actually, the Benjaminian term now time is perhaps more apt, as a split between what has been and what will be. Time is nothing between future and past, but a split which can't be simply understood as a kind of, once again, as a fission between two separately existing terms. The absolute is the current actuality of substanceless time. And actuality here is Wirklichkeit. And this means, reality, but also effectivity, effectuation. It's this effectuation that I think is the contemporaneity, or the contemporaneity that philosophy must strive to comprehend. So long as substance is represented, the authority, of substance will be understood in terms as conceptless, and this is space and time are understood as forms of intuition, as juxtaposed to the concept, the conceptual determination. As long as substance is represented, conceptual necessity remains extrinsic to substantial determination. In other words, once again, conceptual necessity is superimposed upon, an intuitive, a spatial-temporal manifold, which in itself is devoid of determination. And Hegel is saying that we must think, by thinking substance as subject, we can think of conceptual determination as intrinsic to objectivity. And finally, self-reflecting substance, that this idea, this claim that the absolute is self-reflecting substance, means that the subjects, which is conceptual self-relation, is the iteration of the occurrence of what Hegel calls the absolute essence, indivision as division. This is in the opening passage. So this means that the actuality of the absolute is substance becoming subject as a temporal break or a rupture. We have to think of the absolute as the occurrence of time, where the occurrence of time is no longer thought as, is to be thought as precisely as a kind of, as a radical discontinuity, as a kind of a break or incision into the continuity, into any kind of substantial continuity. And absolute knowing is the effectuation of this rupture. So that what Hegel calls absolute knowing, the becoming subject of substance, is precisely it's thinking the present, what is happening now, as a radical break, as a scission, as a radical discontinuity. Okay, I'm going to stop now because I've gone on for a long time, and I know there's a lot of questions here. So,
if you want, we can go through order.
Sure. Okay.
Mine is actually the first question.
Okay.
It's still having difficulty grappling with this idea of freedom, a version of freedom that is the mover of sorts of its own procreation or contingent existence. Is this not the role of the master over the object for itself?
Well, freedom, in a way, what Hegel has been saying is, first of all, that freedom cannot be achieved. Freedom can only be achieved in and through notion or the concept, but also only in and through spirit, which is to say that freedom is either collective or not at all. very simple. So the master is unfree. The master thinks he's free, but in fact, he's unfree because his self-assertion, assertion of sovereignty, is actually conditioned by the labor of the bondsman or the slave. So in other words, what he's saying is that there's freedom is not simply the absence of determination, but nor is it self-determination if the self is substantialized, if the self is understood as somehow subsisting independently of any relation to another. So because the self is actually constituted by its relationship to another, and to another self-conscious, not just another self-consciousness, but a community of self-consciousnesses. That means that it doesn't understand its own freedom, so long as it doesn't understand how its independence, the achievement of its independence, is necessarily, mediated upon the independence of others. Okay. Independence, any individual independence, depends upon the independence of others. So,
from just to hop in and add to that, then determining what qualifies as a subject becomes a crucial problem. Or no?
What qualifies as a subject? Yes, I mean,
or a self-conscious subject.
Yes, and for Hegel, the whole point is that, in a way, both Descartes and Kant have incomplete understandings of subjectivity. He thinks that, and interestingly, he actually doesn't use the word subject very often in the text, the main sections of the phenomenology. He uses it in the preface and introduction, but most of the time he's talking about consciousness or self-consciousness. And in a way, what he means by, or you only get, the term subject appears at the very beginning of the book and at the very end of the book, because he thinks that to understand what a subject is, you have to understand what self-relating negativity is, or you have to understand what it means for substance to be reflected into itself, because that's what the subject is. And anything short of that is not a subject in any kind of proper sense, he thinks. So once again, so Hegel, so the subject is precisely not, an individual. Okay? It's not the kind of the subject of, individual consciousness, nor is it an aggregate. Is it the sum of an aggregate of these individual consciousnesses? Yet nor is it some kind of entirely this anonymous invariant, which it is in Kant, the I or he or she, or it, the thing that thinks. And in a way, what he's doing is that he's showing how, Kant's transcendental subject can only be understood as through the kind of collective self-consciousness, which he thinks is what spirit is. But so spirit is subject, but spirit is nothing but the reflection into self of substance. And if you go back to understand this, you have to go back again to what to that passage from the Force and Understanding where he's talking about the absolute essence, or the absolute. This is his kind of absolutely. I mean, this is what the absolute is for Hegel. This kind of indivision as indivision of division and indivision, contradiction, and he thinks that this is what this is why you can't, in a way, you can't really understand subjectivity without understanding this substance's reflection into self through contradiction. And that means that the subject is neither individual, nor is it an abstract universal, but this doesn't, he doesn't end up in a kind of historicism. It's not like it's not as if there have been these different kind of. The subject isn't just this, whatever kind of historical self-consciousness human beings have enjoyed, and this is very important. I mean, history. Hegel here is not. Time is irreducible to history. This is what he's saying. What is history? History is merely a catalogue of recorded facts. So in a way, any appeal to history is going to be, appealing to history is no more nor less authoritative than appealing to geology or biology or anthropology. And what he wants to say is that, it's given that all these species of knowledge depend upon a kind of, what he calls a spiritual self-consciousness. You can't understand the history of spirit or the history of subjectivity of any series of facts, any series of historiographical facts. Appeals to kind of, and so this is why he's saying that we don't, history is an unknown, so that time, what has happened, is not yet determined, because the consciousness, self-consciousness entails, in a way, a relationship, asserting a relationship to the past and the future, which will determine what has happened. Okay, this is why, every kind of self-consciousness, self-consciousness is an attempt to think what has happened, but what has happened, is not objectively fixed at the level of empirical fact. What has happened, in a way, is still up for grabs. And this is a Benjaminian, motif. This is Rebecca Comey has this very Benjaminian reading, but I think this is a kind of a positive, fruitful way to make sense about the link between subjectivity and time. There's a link between subjectivity and time, where to be a subject subjectivity is a time of temporal self-consciousness, or historical self-consciousness, but in a sense where history is understood as the interval between the past and the future, and an interval whose kind of parameters can't simply be stipulated by appealing to historiography. So I mean, this is what he says. Like, it's a more radical claim than any kind of historicism, which says that what it means to be a subject depends upon your kind of socio-historical kind of circumstances. He's saying that in a way, what it is to be a subject is to experience time in a certain way, but to experience time in a way which is irreducible to chronology, to any chronology, whether that chronology is cosmological, biological, or or even historiographical.
Thanks. I think Hunter is the next question.
Okay.
Hunter, do you
yeah, let me see. Yes, my big question is why absolute knowing would ever know itself any less than absolutely, or how the unfolding of human history needs to happen at all. Okay.
Hunter, you're still muted right now. We still can't hear you. Your mic might not be working, but if you type in the sidebar, I can speak for you. Sorry, not sure. Or maybe, oh, can you speak one more time? Nope, okay. Maybe you can type in the sidebar and we can move on to a different question for now. Okay. So Kevin had a question. He's watching the video on YouTube right now. And his question is, what is the negative's relation to time? And what is the negative's relation to the whole or the absolute?
Okay, well, there is a relationship between time and negativity, and it's, in a way, when Kant says that time is formless or formlessness as such, so time is precisely what resists any kind of positive characterization. An attempt to, in other words, time, Kant says time yields no shape. Time was subordinated to movement. For Aristotle, time is the number of movement with respect to before and after, which is to say that time is merely gauged in terms of physical movement. And in fact, ultimately it's reducible to actualization, where actualization is the actualization of a potential. So time merely measures the degrees of actualization. In fact, the term actuality has this Aristotelian provenance. So once, famously, as Deleuze says with Kant, time is no longer, is freed from its subordination to movement. So time is no longer the number, a measure of movement. And in fact, we have to think of time as somehow the condition for movement. Time as this independent dimension within which all movement occurs. So time has a kind of link to negativity because it's difficult to give it a positive conceptual characterization once you decouple it from substantial movement. And I think in a way that also time being this thing which is always, as Augustine already said, that you can't even decompose time into presence. Time has no substance. Okay, time is paradigmatically linked to the negation of substance, because substance is what is actual or self-present or self-identical, albeit to a relative degree, whereas time is what is never self-present or self-identical. And however hard you try to, you cannot grasp time in terms of any kind of substance. So in a way, so I think so. This is, I guess, the most fundamental sense in which time is linked to negativity, because it is not. It has no being. It's the negation of being. You can try to kind of recuperate time within being through the notion of becoming, but once again, where becoming is the way in which the sensible participates in the intelligible, and becoming is understood as actualization, and the logic of actualization is the exchange of contraries. But now with modernity, with philosophical modernity, time is decoupled from substance. So now the challenge is to kind of is to think it, and to think it, independently of substance. No longer to subordinate it to substance as traditionally conceived. So I guess so. So time is also. Here's the other link to time. There's a link between time and contradiction, because how do you avoid contradiction? You can say, well, nothing can be simultaneously P and not P. So long as there's an interval of time, contradiction is avoided. If A is P, at T1, and then not P at T2, there's no contradiction. Okay, so you can always kind of stave off contradiction by appealing to time, but only by appealing to an interval of time. The problem would be, well, how do you define the how do you define this kind of the character of this interval in and of itself? And of course you can't. You can only, it's measured in relationship to something else. Every interval of time is measured chronometrically in some way. And in itself then, once time is decoupled from measure, then time becomes that which is essentially contradictory. Because time is that which is, as in MacTaggart's famous argument for the non-existence of time, is because in order to, you can't, time doesn't, any attempt to understand time involves, determinations which are either, which are incompatible with self-identity or self-presence. So any attempt to understand the difference between the past, the present, and the future involves trying to understand this difference independently of the identity of a present, because you can't fix the identity of the present independently of the past or the future, but you can't fix those identities independently of the identity of the present. And the problem is that time has no identity. Time is the negation of identity. So I think, so that's the, I think that the link between time and negativity. So shall I address Hunter's question?
Yeah. Hunter, we might be able to hear you now too.
Can you hear me?
Perfect, great.
Yes.
So I'll just read what I just wrote before. So yeah, in the final few paragraphs of Absolute Knowing, 805 through 807, he does talk a lot about the catalog of historical knowledge and the unfolding of history, and generations knowing about previous generations, and turning actuality into knowledge. And so, well, that seems to go against the the reading, you're sort of distilling the sort of absolute, the break, the discontinuity.
Mm-hmm.
So what are your comments on those last few paragraphs, but also specifically how, like, I don't see how the unfolding of history as this kind of increase of knowledge or of self-knowing is entailed by his concept of the absolute. Like, why, he seems to really want to say that the absolute, didn't know itself very well before, and now like knows itself really well because of Hegel. And how, yeah, like why would there ever be less than absolute knowing?
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yes. It's okay. Very good question. So he writes in, I think the final paragraph, 808, he talks about the becoming of spirits, and then, in a way, he's prefiguring his kind of his system, his philosophy of nature. Nature being, understood as a kind of, the self-externalization of the concept, and he talks about the becoming of, the becoming of nature is a living immediate becoming of spirits, but this becoming has another side, which is history. And history is a conscious self-mediating process. And he says, spirit emptied out into time. But this externalization, this kenosis, is equally an externalization of itself. So negative is the negative of itself. This becoming presents a slow-moving succession of spirits, a gallery of images, each of which, endowed with all the riches of spirit, moves us slowly, just because the self has to penetrate and digest this entire wealth of its substance. Fulfillment consists in perfectly knowing what it is, in knowing its substance. This knowing is its withdrawal into itself, in which it abandons its outward existence and gives its existential shape over to recollection. Now these, okay, obviously, what I've, my interpretation, is dubitable and, questionable. But I think that the issue is this, is that when Hegel talks about history, and when he talks about this kind of this, he uses the word recollection. Spirit achieves self-consciousness in a way by recollecting its previous stages or moments. But the claim is, like, when does this recollection happen? It happens in absolute spirit, but is absolute spirit necessarily the culminating point of a process, of a series, which terminates with absolute spirit? If it does, then absolute spirit is substance in the traditional sense, because it's the end of this movement. Okay, you've got the self-externalization, then the return into self, but the return into self is definitive. Read what Hegel says about the absolute notion. It's because it's contradictory. It has no kind of stability. Okay, it has no kind of equilibrium. Okay, it can't remain within itself. Okay, it's always divided against itself. So I think, one can understand this claim about absolute spirit as a kind of historical self-consciousness. Yes, but history now is understood from the vantage point of the present. Okay, and then this doesn't go against. So in other words, what counts as history? How we understand the the historical events, that led up to us, that led up to our particular self-consciousness, is something we do from our present vantage point. But it seems to me that it's not necessary to interpret this as Hegel saying there is this absolute historical sequence out there. This historical sequence constitutes a kind of spirit's historical substance. As if then, and this is a traditional metaphysical reading, where you say each, spirit has to go, the absolute has to go through these stages. Okay, each stage is imperfect, but eventually it culminates in absolute spirit. But absolute spirit, because absolute spirit is actual, it can only be actual. Absolute spirit is now, here and now. Okay, but then but this would be the end of. That was a very prevalent reading, but it's also the reading that people thought was absurd and that made Hegel sound completely ridiculous. I think the better or a more plausible reading of this is that, yes, of course, self-consciousness in the present is historical necessarily, because modernity is the sense of history as a structure of occurrence. A structure of occurrence which has generated what is happening now, but this generation need not be understood as an ineluctable historical sequence. Whether or not you're willing to substantialize history and say that the absolute, actualizes itself in and through history, where history is the medium for the self-actualization of the absolute. And if Hegel was saying this, all his precautions against, hasty substantializations or kind of, preemptive substantializations would count for naught. I think if one, given the epistemic challenges he set himself at the beginning, clearly historical knowledge, is every bit as conditioned by, is every bit as dependent upon, specific, conceptual resources as any other kind of empirical knowledge. This is why there is no such thing as absolute historical knowledge. There can't be such a thing as absolute history, which is not the same as saying that the absolute occurs as history. Okay? You can understand the absolute occurring as history precisely once history is evental. History is evental occurrence and not simply this substantial medium within which all these events are contained and serially connected to one another. So yes, no, I realize that this is okay, and then so knowledge of historical stages is important for our our contemporary, for our self-consciousness now, for our consciousness, now in this present, for our actual self-consciousness. But of course, this historical knowledge is like our physical knowledge, or biological knowledge, or political knowledge. It is itself not absolute. Remember the distinction between absolute knowing and absolute knowledge. Absolute knowing means the ability for knowing to be self-determining and self-effectuating. But it doesn't mean knowing everything there is to know, or believing that there's nothing else to know, that you've achieved definitive and satisfactory knowledge of every fact about the world.
Then I guess that the key is like the desubstantializing. Oh gosh, I'm hearing. Hold on.
I'm just.
So if he is the desubstantializing of history, then it's like retroactively positing the whole of history. It's not like the absolute is what really generated the whole of history. It's like the starting point is the present, basically. And yeah, I guess I kind of understand that.
So that the consciousness of history is internal to self-consciousness in the present. And this is what, so that spirit is essentially historical, because as self-conscious, it cannot but be conscious of everything, that's preceded it, but its self-consciousness of its own historicity, of what came before it, is immanent to it, is part of its own kind of internal structure. Then you also have a question here about knowing. Yes, what is it about absolute knowing that requires that it knows itself less than absolutely? What is it about? Well, in a way, again, like it.
Okay. I mean, maybe that makes it in a way because so it's not like there was a time when it knew itself less exactly.
Yes.
It's that this is the concept now, and so the previous stages are retroactively projected, basically.
Yes, and it's not as if you could somehow stand outside of history. I mean, this is I think the absurd traditional interpretation. Hegel saying, now that history is completed, I can stand back, I can look at the entire sequence of history and kind of measure the degrees of proximity to the absolute. And now we have absolute knowing, and it's me, and it's my philosophy, and everything else was just leading up to this. Lots of people have thought that's what Hegel was saying, but I think Hegel is too intelligent to have said something. So, it's not, the problem is not that it's an arrogant claim. Hegel was nothing if not arrogant. The problem is that it's kind of conceptually incoherent, I think, given his own, commitments, given his own philosophical commitments.
I think that makes a lot of
so there can be an absoluteness to knowing, which doesn't mean that which doesn't require us to understand this knowing as the kind of the encapsulation of the totality of facts or the totality of truths.
Hunter.
Okay, and yes, the question about the increase, the radical breaks Hegel articulates seem to conciliate together as a sort of increase. Okay, so now this is the question about, there is a progress. Clearly, in Hegel's account, there is a progress. And the phenomenology is an account of like cognitive process, of like, coming to self-consciousness. But again, the question is this progress internal to the phenomenon? Because remember, the phenomenology culminates in Hegel's own philosophical self-consciousness of the present of modernity, of this break, inaugurated by the French Revolution. And in a way, and the logic, the necessity that is at work, he says, is operating behind the back of the the shapes of consciousness that he is studying. He's saying it's in itself for us, for we the phenomenological observers. So once again, it's now, what he's saying is that now we can see how the otherwise contingent series of shapes of consciousness that's can be understood in terms of the unfolding of a kind of necessity, the accumulation of determinate negations. But again, what Hegel says about necessity, necessity is retroactively constituted. You understand how what happened was necessary for you to be conscious of the present in the way in which you are now. But this necessity is precisely what you need to construct now. And what you're not doing is kind of is reifying it and saying that this necessity is somehow, once again, you can't substantialize it and say that this necessity, that the sequence has a necessity independently of my current self-consciousness. And I think Hegel is very clear about that. He's saying that the necessity, a necessity because it's not, the necessity is not simply understood as the actualization of a possibility. He's not saying that this had to, this always had to happen in the way in which it did, because if you did that understanding, you'd be talking about a kind of substantial becoming. You'd be talking about substantial becoming. Whereas he's saying that this notional becoming is necessary in and for the notion, in and for the self-understanding of the notion. Now, what complicates this, of course, is this philosophy of nature. So the claim, the biggest obstacle for the interpretation I'm giving, or for the non-metaphysical interpretation, is Hegel's philosophy of nature, where he does seem to be saying that nature, that there is a necessity, conceptual necessity operative in nature, which leads ineluctably to the development of human self-consciousness. And not just human self-consciousness, but ultimately European, German self-consciousness. So I think the philosophy of nature is the biggest, problem to this kind of, allegedly non-metaphysical reading. But then people have made attempts, and Terry Pinkard has tried to kind of come up with a account of Hegel's philosophy of nature. But it's true that there Hegel does talk about necessity, and he talks about conceptual necessity, in nature, and that's a problem for my reading, or for my attempt, for this kind of the attempted interpretation here. But I think in the phenomenology, it's possible to avoid that, to say that the necessity, he's not talking about historical necessity in a metaphysical sense. And I think that the evidence for that is pretty substantial. Okay.
So Aaron, your question is next. I'll repaste the first one if you want.
Sure. You want me to read it out, or is it fine? Can you see it, right?
I could, yes. So is the subject's understanding of itself as self-reflection of substance comparable at all to the fusing of Wilfred Sellers's manifest and scientific images, i.e., can it be understood as a task of understanding how the mechanical world of physics gives rise to conceptual normativity of language spirits, i.e., can it be understood as the difference of knowing something to be true makes in the world? Yes, obviously, that's one way. I think, yes, it's certainly comparable. It's more explicit in Hegel. There's a Hegelian moment in Sellers, and I think when he talks about the fusing the images, on reconciling kind of efficient causation, physical causation with normative necessity. Yes, he's definitely trying to bring them to achieve the kind of reconciliation that Hegel is. Yes, and it's the difference understood as the difference that knowing something to be true makes in the world. That our cognitive self-consciousness somehow contributes to the realization of the world, or contributes to the kind of nature's self-effectuation. But you have to be very careful here, because it can't contribute in a kind of, if it's contributing in a teleological way, if there's a perfect continuity, a teleological continuity from from the kinds of that unfold in nature to the kinds of becomings that unfold in cognition, then this is metaphysical in an objectionable sense, in a sense which is, I think, anti-modern, because in a way, the erosion of the centrality of necessity is part of the critical destitution of metaphysics. Metaphysics is all about necessary connections. It's saying that the world can be known because there are the mind is a faithful mirror of nature, and the necessary connections in thought mirror the necessary connections in things. That's metaphysics. We now know, we now know that there are no, empirical science has gradually corroded our, faith in necessary connections in things. Okay, so necessity was relegated to the mind or to the subject, and also in Hegel are trying to find ways to kind of, to understand, to reconcile normative or conceptual necessity with natural contingency, without regressing to a kind of a metaphysical, a traditional metaphysical position, which always requires the appeal to, a divine, a preordained correspondence between the natural order and the conceptual order. But if you relinquish this correspondence or this pre-established harmony, you have to find another way of reconciling necessity and contingency. Actually, that and Hegel arguably goes further along this, in terms of, I think, he goes further along this way than Sellers does. Maybe Sellers remains too Kantian, because it's not, in Sellers the fusing the image remains something like a kind of an ideal or an infinite task, whereas Hegel insists that it can be that the fusion is actual but not definitive. I think the challenge in Hegel is to understand how absoluteness can be, how absoluteness is compatible with alterity, okay? With alterity, or with something can be absolute without being I think that's the kind of the part of the challenge of understanding Hegel. So I think, and I actually think that Sellers is it midway between Kant and Hegel. So I think there are definitely Hegelian insights in Sellers, but the fusing, the stereoscopic fusion remains, well, in a way, it's because of, like, perhaps I think because he was frightened, or he feared a kind of the excesses of what he took to be a kind of, dogmatic Hegelianism, that in a way he wanted to, not simply say that the kind of the fusion could be could be effectuated. But if it's not effectuated, it remains something like a regulative ideal. And well, Hegel's got a critique of that, of the whole idea of the infinite task. And let me answer the other part of your question. What is the original German for absolute knowing?
So Christian cleared that. So that became clear. It's das absolute Wissen, yeah?
Wissen, yes, it's Wissen, yes.
But so in Terry Pinkert's translation, and I kind of, at least with my German knowledge, agree with this, Wissen can't really be translated as knowing, and Pinkert doesn't use absolute knowing at all. Only absolute knowledge shows up in Pinkert. And yeah, I have a hard time also. I've seen Eric Cannon as either cognition and knowing. In a lot of places, I've never seen wissen as knowing. And so I guess I wanted you to talk more about then what sort of, are these two separate terms in German and Hegel that I'm missing somehow, that absolute knowing and absolute knowledge? Or are they the same German term that are being translated in two separate ways in English? And this is more of a sort of exegetical necessity that we need to understand this concept in two different ways to understand the distinction between absolute knowing and knowledge, but that in the German is the same term. Yes, and the Miller is the other book I have. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think it's the there is a distinction between erkennen, and wissen, but I think I think the distinction I'm trying to make is, in a way, I think that Finlay's translation is fortuitous, even if it's inexact, because it allows us, it invites us to make a conceptual distinction. And Miller, it is absolute knowing, knowledge, and knowledge. Erkennen is acquaintance. Erkennen is cognition, and this is the word. I mean, I need to think more about why he uses the word wissen as opposed to erkennen. I think maybe to mark in a way to mark the distinction between the three stages. I guess acquaintance, cognition, and knowledge as kind of these three stages. So I think using the term wissen, for in the final, in the final stage, I guess would perhaps allow him to mark that this is the kind of the ultimate stage. Okay. But regardless, I mean, whatever term he's used, I still think. I mean, I struggled for a long. I mean, in a way, this is the biggest obstacle to kind of understanding Hegel, is that what on earth would absolute knowledge be? What on earth would absolute knowledge be? Would it mean knowing everything there is to know? Knowing everything there is to know in a way which is incorrigible and infallible? Which is to say, having divine knowledge, knowing what God knows. That's obviously the kind of the traditional interpretation which invites derision. Well, there's another. Mika suggested, wouldn't it just be as a security of knowledge? Well, yes, but the security of knowledge is already available with consciousness and self-consciousness. I mean, knowledge has a kind of reliability without long before you get to the stage of absolute knowledge. In other words, you can't simply arbitrarily, Hegel's critiques of skepticism means that you can vanquish skepticism, without the resort to absolute knowledge. I mean, I think Hegel's argument against skepticism worked independently of his account of absolute knowledge. So in other words, it doesn't seem that absolute knowledge is required to stave off radical skepticism. And the whole image of the self-moving substance is an image of God too, no? Well, look, is God the absolute essence? Here's the question. Is God the absolute essence? In that passage I quote, this is when Hegel talks about the universal blood, the absolute essence of everything. Is that God? it doesn't sound much like God, or at least you could call it God if you want to, but it's not sure what kind of you'd be gaining by calling it God. It certainly has very little to do with any kind of the traditional metaphysical characterizations of God. So although I think absolute knowledge is absolute, so the question is, what does the word absolute mean? And I think the problem is understanding the relationship between the absolute and the whole. And Hegel says the true is the whole, and people identify the absolute with the whole, where the whole is understood as this definitively actualized. The whole is what encompasses everything. Everything is a part of the whole, but the whole would be this actually existing totality. But then if it's an actually existing totality, animated by what Hegel calls the absolute essence, which is contradiction, then how does it secure its perpetuity? How does it, in other words, I think that there is, Hegel clearly believes that in the idea of an infinite totality, of an infinite whole. That's what the absolute is. It's an, the notion, it's an infinite whole. An infinite whole has parts, but it's not clear that, well, I mean, I think the key Slovenian claim is that an infinite totality is precisely something that can't be bounded. It's unbounded, and therefore it doesn't have a kind of. It doesn't have the kind of. It will never reach the the point of homeostatic equilibrium that the traditional notion of whole implies. Okay? And again, the metaphysical reading says, yes, the absolute is the reconciliation of every contradiction. Therefore, the absolute is definitive. It can't be, absolute knowing is just a kind of the recollection of the self-differentiation of, the absolute in and through speculative thinking. But there's nothing more, this is different. There's nothing more to think, nothing more to be discovered.
So Ray, I just want to give you a time check. I don't want to go over what you're able to. We're at 12:40 right now.
So okay, well, I'll try to address the next questions. So yes, I mean, look, I think about Hegel's actuality. Okay, in a way, clearly, every philosopher has, thinks partly. There's a tension between, their insights, and, in Hegel, it may be that there are kind of, these, theological residues in Hegel, though perhaps they're not as, as virulent as has sometimes been claimed. And it's true that he often says lots of things that invite this kind of traditional reading. But the traditional reading is precisely what makes Hegel anachronistic. Okay, and he makes Hegel completely anachronistic. All this stuff about reconciliation and the end of history, and the idea that kind of rational self-consciousness culminates in the Prussian state. Hegel has been ridiculed for all these claims. So I'm not saying that he doesn't say things which are ridiculous, but maybe he's ridiculous in a more interesting way. And it's this interpretation of him is, I think, reductive. It's not that he doesn't say things that, you know, invite this interpretation, but he also says things that are very, very much more intriguing and surprising. And he says a lot of them, okay? I mean, there's ample evidence for the kind of, you know, for the non-metaphysical reading. So the question is whether, and it seems, you know, this remarkable claim that philosophy is its own time comprehended in thought means that if philosophy is conditioned by time, where time is precisely not simple kind of, is not chronology or historiography, then that means that there's always going to be something new to think. And then the question is, you know, does Hegel give us some of the resources we need to think, well, not just to think what is happening now, but to think of happening as such. The reactivation of Hegel can't just be taking Hegelian categories and transplanting them into the present. That would be kind of, I mean, that would be in a way dogmatic Hegelianism. It's the claim that what Hegel allows you to understand is the structure of happening or of occurrence as such. And because he's a thinker of contradiction, he's a thinker of antagonism. He's a really, you know, unparalleled thinker of antagonism. And this is in a way his most vital and, you know, still, yeah, still kind of current contribution. So, yes, so that's what, you know, that's what kind of animates this kind of, this reading, which, you know, I admit is, you know, has to, you know, there are lots of difficult questions it has to answer, but it's really, you know, but the readings proposed by Comé and you know, Zizek and Dolar are really kind of, I think that this is, they're in line with this kind of interpretation. And in fact, you know, clearly this is, you know, Zizek's been saying stuff like this for a long time. There's another question here.
Ivan, do you want to speak?
Is there the remark about Fred Beiser? Absolute idealism for Hegel, so says Beiser, entails rational intelligibility, monistic holism, and vitalistic self-movement. Yeah, Beiser, you know, is, you know, an excellent historian, but his, I mean, he's basically giving you the kind of the metaphysical Hegel. This is just a traditional Hegel, and that's fine. But that's exactly the reading I'm, you know, all the authors that we're considering are kind of, you know, or most if not all are challenging this reading. So, but this is just a traditional reading, okay? I think you can decouple the claim about rational intelligibility from the monistic holism and vitalistic self-movement. And actually, Beiser's reading is a curious one. Well, maybe it's not so curious. Maybe he just really hates Pippin's reading. Because in a way, like, it's Pippin's reading is, you know, which is quite old now, was dedicated to saying that this is exactly how not to understand Hegel. Yeah, I think that much as I admire Beiser's work, I think on Hegel, I don't find them very, I mean, it's just the traditional reading he's giving you, basically.
Great, thanks.
Aaron has a question. Even though he doesn't use the Schellingian unbedingt, unconditioned, do you think the term absolute in Hegel is comparable? Yes, I mean, yes, it is. And the distinction between unconditioned and absolute is kind of intriguing, I think. Unconditioned, or, you know, unthinged, as it's sometimes been translated. I think, you know, that's, I guess it's a kind of a, I think it's a more attractive word than absolute, because absolute suggests this huge monolithic thing, okay? Whereas I think to desubstantialize the absolute is to precisely not to understand it as a thing, and not even a process, because it's, some people say, oh, the absolute is a process in movement. But yeah, but a process is still a thing, however internally differentiated it is. Next question is
by Ivan.
Yes.
Ivan, can you speak?
I'm having trouble understanding. If self-consciousness equals substance as subject, and time has no substance, per Augustine, yet subject achieves its self-consciousness through recollection of itself in time. How is this possible without some kind of substance within temporality, which could elections? Well, I think I'm going to answer in a similar way to the way in which I answered Hunter. I think you also was kind of asking a version of this question. In other words, yes, what is the subject, or what is self-consciousness doing when it's recollecting, when it's, what is, how are we to understand historical self-consciousness? Well, because clearly the distinction between past and future is constitutive of consciousness, and this is part of Augustine's whole account. If consciousness is also kind of structured around the difference between what has been and what is not yet, what is no longer and what is not yet, then this is the kind of the experience of the passing of time, which resists kind of reduction to chronology. So Hegel would just be saying that self-conscious, any moment, any kind of realization of self-consciousness will be structured around the difference between what is no longer and what is not yet, the past and the future. But this doesn't, so because he's, now obviously this is not, the past now can't be interiorized to, as if consciousness was a substance though. So in other words, the question is really like, if I'm denying that history has a substance, am I just relativizing it to consciousness and saying that it's entirely subjective, so that its self-consciousness gets to decide what has happened, gets to adjudicate the difference between future. But at the stage, and I think the response to this is at the stage when Hegel, what has happened with absolute knowing is that the distinction between has been overcome. The distinction between thought and being has been overcome. So in a way, there's no longer, so the distinction between what is merely internal to self-consciousness and what is external to self-consciousness is also overcome. What he's saying is that that the difference between what is no longer and what is not yet is constitutive of self-consciousness, but in a way which isn't simply kind of which in a way which can't simply be subjectivized or understood as in a completely subjectivistic register. So self-consciousness, in a way, so that it's internal. So in a way, self-consciousnness has a memory. It has a kind of, it's engaged in, it's recollecting its previous moments. But this is a conceptual recollection. It's an act of conceptual construction. and therefore it's an act of conceptual construction in which it is adjudicating what happened, what has happened to lead, to lead up to it, to make it be having the experiences that it's having now. So I think that we don't have to substantialize temporality either objectively, either kind of by saying that history is this kind of absolute medium, nor saying that everything is simply unfolding internally to self-consciousness, because the distinction between the interiority and exteriority has been superseded. I'm sorry, I just need to plug in my computer. I'll be right back.
No problem. We're 10 to 1 right now, so we've already gone 20 minutes over. So maybe
I didn't want to take up more time by piling on another question, but I just went for it anyway. But I totally understand. So much to think over from the lecture.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, I just have to plug this in. Yes. Okay, sorry. So yeah, I don't know if that's.
Yeah.
So it's is recollecting itself,
right?
But it's a question of what is time? Is time a form of interiority, which it is in Augustine and Kant, or is it a form of exteriority, which it is, in the metaphysical tradition? But then the problem is, what kind of exteriority is it? What is time? And I'm not saying that Hegel has, a definitive answer, but I think he offers an answer which overcomes this distinction between interiority and exteriority,
which is the conceptual. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Yes, the conceptual. Sorry, I didn't hear
the conceptual or sort of discursive or normative structure of how you structure those recollections within subjectivity.
Yes, yes, because you're going to. There's two aspects to this. Is that one is that you're going to, there's a kind of there's a recollection in the sense of that, again, what is, what would be recollection for a collective self-consciousness? And obviously, that's dispute. What has happened and what hasn't happened is disputed. That's also something over which there are contradictions. Think of the debates about genocides, or think about debates about imperialism. History is nothing if not fraught with disputes over what happened. So what Hegel is saying is that these disputes can only be conceptually adjudicated. We need conceptual resources to be able to make sense about what has happened. Any assertion or denial about what has happened conceptually adjudicated. So we have to and conceptual self-consciousness is necessary in order for us to make sense of, which doesn't simply mean trying to achieve consensus, but actually understanding what the fundamental contradictions are. And the French Revolution is a great example, because and even for Hegel, it's a completely divisive event. It's an event which is either the opening of a new era, which must be affirmed, and for which we must, and to be facilitated, or it's a disaster. It's a kind of an absolute disaster, and we must prevent it from ever happening again. So I think with Hegel, recollection is not simply, remembering what has been, as if what has been can be kind of, uncontroversially adjudicated. There's a fundamental kind of division, or there are going to be kind of radical disagreements about what has happened. Constitutive of, it seems to me, of spirit, because the idea of a spirit that's, the idea of a spirit that has achieved, that is in perfect kind of harmonious self-agreement about what has happened, that would be a spirit that is no longer riven by contradiction or division. And again, that's a common interpretation of what Hegel means by the end of history. And I think this goes against the kind of what he says about the absolute essence as contradiction. The absolute essence, everything that is contradictory. So therefore, how can contradiction be definitively reconciled?
Earlier for this question, I asked, would it be fair to say that the rupture between the past and the future could be characterized as negation of a negation, if the past and the future don't have that substance?
Yes, and in fact he does. Hegel does have a philosophy of time. In his philosophy of nature, he begins by talking about the difference between space and time, and he talks about, let me see if I can find it here. Yes, his definition of time. Yes, it's in 257 of section 1 of his philosophy of nature, mechanics. So time. Okay, here's his definition of time. Time. Negativity as point relates itself to space, in which it develops its determinations as line and plane. But in the sphere of self-externality, negativity is equally for itself, and so are its determinations. These are posited in the sphere of self-externality, and negativity in so doing appears as indifferent to the inert side-by-sideness of space. Negativity, thus posited for itself, is time. Time is negativity posited for itself. Okay, here's another. Time as the negative unity of self-externality is similarly an out-and-out abstract ideal being. It is that being which, inasmuch as it is not, and inasmuch as it is not, is. It is becoming directly intuited. This means that differences which admittedly are purely momentary, directly self-sublating, are determined as external, i.e. as external to themselves. So he gives, he explains, he defines time in his discussion of physics. So he links space and time, but in a way, what I think he's saying is that time is the kind of the most entry form of this contradictoriness. It's the most schematic, his account, it seems like the most schematic presentation of what he says about the absolute essence. So because time is contradictory, time is negativity for itself, but it's not yet negativity in and for itself. And I think self-consciousness is negativity in and for itself, which is why self-consciousness, it seems to me, is structured as an intimate relationship with time. It's also temporal consciousness.
Did you just say that time is negativity in itself and self-consciousness is negativity in and for itself?
No, he says it's for itself.
For itself.
He says negativity, thus posited for itself, is time. Negativity for it.
Okay. That's great. Thank you very much.
Okay, and then there's, so Hunter has another remark. It most seems to me like Emerson's self-reliance is a meaningful comparison. We start with the present and its concerns and recast history according to the needs of present contradiction and hopes. Yes, I mean, yeah, basically, yes. I think this is, yeah, a very appropriate comparison. I guess, I mean, all I'm trying to suggest is that Hegel, I think that Hegel is a thinker of discontinuity. He's he's rather, he wants to think the continuance, sorry, the coincidence of continuity and discontinuity. And in that sense, he wants to think how any relationship to, we can only relate to the past through a sense of any continuity with the past must be an assertion of discontinuity. Which is to say, we must also be conscious of everything that separates us from the past. But this is the condition of understanding or link to it. And I think that, and this would be modern self-consciousness, as opposed to thinking that there's an unbroken or a seamless continuity, where the present is only ever a continuation of the past. Okay, it's
so we're
here.
Yeah. Would you like to say which sections we'll be reading for next week, and then?
Yes, actually, yes. Just let me double check.
I hope we can look at the logic. I know we're kind of behind.
Is this week 3 or 4? Are we already? Is this week 4?
This is the 5th week, actually.
Oh, we're already in week 5.
Yes.
Okay, we're even further behind than I thought. Look, if you want, I'm happy. I mean, originally, yes, I had planned to look at the openings, extracts from the logic, and I was going to go immediately to the secondary stuff, and I think it was, well, if it's already week 5, it was going to be, I think, Comé and Dolar.
Random science, or the spirit of trust.
Yes, the end of the spirit of trust. But okay, if we do that, then the problem is that we can't. I wanted to, if we do Brandom, Comé and Dolar, and Zizek, okay, that's 3 sessions. If we do the logic, we'd have to add a kind of a 9th session, which I'm willing to give up, one of the secondary readings. And I really don't mind which. I mean, whatever, if people have a preference.
I'm much more interested in hearing what you have to say about the logic. I'm really loving hearing you personally talk about Hegel, and so I'd be okay with missing one of the ones about secondary literature.
Okay, well that's okay. Then the logic, yeah, fine. I'm happy. Then let's.
Hey Ray, did you see what I said? It was a suggestion. Because it's widely said that the reflection part of the logic is the most compacted figures of the dialectical process. I was suggesting maybe we do the reflection part of the logic.
Okay.
And we get the more compressed form.
Yes, I mean, I agree. I completely agree, and it would actually be continuous with today's discussion as opposed to focusing on the opening. So I'm happy to do the logic of essence, and I think I'm just trying to find the original syllabus I had, because I do have a version of the syllabus with an extract from the Logic of Essence.
I can pull it up and then share it on my screen right now.
Okay.
Okay, 1 sec.
Okay, well, look, if we're doing the doctrine of essence, then it's, I think it's page,
All right, so here's what I have as the.
Yep, go on.
Oh, here's what I have as the syllabus up here. You can click on my window down at the bottom.
Yep, yeah, no, it doesn't have the essence. Okay, so this was just at the introduction. It skips the essence. So, okay, let's do essence. The page references for essence. I have a PDF of Pinkard's. No, the Giovanni translation of the Science of Logic, which is the most recent one. So the doctrine of essence is 337. I think we should do up to, well, we should begin with the becoming of essence. So we should read from page 326 of the Giovanni translation of Science of Logic to
is this posted on the classroom?
no.
Giovanni.
This reading in the syllabus.
Okay.
I guess we should go to contradiction, but that's quite a lot of reading.
When I mentioned it, I was just referring to exclusively part, and we could do more, but like even just the reflection, it gets the figures of, you know, presupposition and then external reflection and then determinate reflection, which I think captures the key parts of it very well.
Well, that would take us up to 353. So that's, yeah. So that's pages.
It's all just like a repetition of that, you know.
Ray, could you repeat that one more time?
So okay, let's then say 326, pages 326 to 353 in the Giovanni translation, and I actually have. I'll send a PDF because I think I have a PDF of it.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll do that, and then I guess after that we'll decide which of the secondary stuff people would like to actually to do, basically.
Super. If you send me the PDF, I can post it in the classroom.
Okay, great. Okay, so yeah, there's no class next week because I'm traveling again. So the next class will be on the in 2 weeks' time, which I think is the 27th.
Correct.
Of November. The 27th of November.
Yeah. Did everyone heard that? 27th is the next class.
And Ray, are you going to post the Science of Logic stuff ASAP, or I'm just curious?
Yes, no, I'll send it
Awesome.
tonight. Yeah, I'll send it tonight, so that way you can.
I'll post it as soon as you send it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks,
Great. Thanks. Okay. Thanks. And so I'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
sounds good. Have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Ray.
Good night.